to go through. So thank you for coming in person, but we will share the recording. For the certificates, we do ask that you complete 75% of the workshop to claim that. So that's another. All right, with that, I will pass it over to Vola, who will do some intros and we'll kick off the workshop.
Thank you, Phil. And for those of you who did not recognize Phil's voice, that was Phil from our studio, but I'm sure all of you know Phil in his voice. But hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm excited to be here as well as a part of the organizing committee. And I'm excited to introduce Nathaniel, who is going to be our lead for the workshop. So Nathaniel is a data and decision scientist helping teams solve problems at the intersection of analytics, data engineering, and real-world healthcare. Nathaniel completed a PhD in cognitive decision science at the University of Basel in Switzerland, where he conducted research in decisions under uncertainty while teaching courses in experimental design and statistical programming. And yes, using R, obviously. From 2018 to 2020, he worked as a real-world data scientist at the Department of Personalized Healthcare at Roche in Basel. In 2020, he joined the Quantitative Science Department at Flatiron Health, where he led the development of computational tools that reduce the amount of time needed to derive insights from real-world data set by as much as 80%. In 2022, Nathaniel co-founded Plinth Analytics, a boutique real-world data analytics company whose goal is to build processes to enable decision makers to obtain meaningful, robust, and repeatable insights from messy real-world data. Thank you, Nathaniel, for coming and hosting the workshop. I'm happy to see your face. I think we've connected back in, I want to say 2019 at one of our in-person, our Pharma in the past. So super happy to have you here and looking forward to the workshop. So take it away.
That's right. Thank you so much. It's so funny. When I was looking over our messages earlier, I saw that I had messaged you a couple of years ago saying, I loved your R Pharma talk. It was so great. Let's keep in touch. And that was the last message, which is so sad. So I'm glad we were able to see each other again.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you so much, everyone. Let me try sharing my screen. Can everyone see my slideshow?
Yes,
awesome. Great. Thank you so much, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here at R Pharma. I absolutely love this conference, the organizers, the people, the topics. It's just such a wonderful intersection, such a wonderful community of people coming together to solve important problems using the best language to get shit done, which is R. So again, my name is Nathaniel. I'm the CTO of Plinth. I'm going to be joined by a special guest later in the workshop, Rich at our studio. And you'll see why a little bit later. But a little heads up, he will be joining us. So first off, a brief introduction to Plinth. As per the introduction, Plinth is a new boutique analytics startup, which was co-founded by myself and my co-founder and CEO, Kieran Mace, who's here as well. Hey, Kieran. We're PhDs with pharma and health tech industry leadership experience, who have spent over 24 years developing biomedical software to derive insights from data, largely using R. R is our powerhouse from everything from the data engineering side to the analytics side, to the reporting side, to the deployment side. It's really amazing how much the R language has evolved since I started using it even 15 years ago back in academic research. And now it's this absolute powerhouse to be able to really do everything from end to end. And especially in the pharma space, we're just seeing applications for it everywhere. So I have a long history of using R, presenting at R conferences. I love the R community. I love coming here. It's such a pleasure. Just to tell a little bit more about Plinth, so where we really see ourselves is at the intersection of three fields, and that is at pharma. So in pharmaceutical life sciences, really focusing on personalized healthcare is our sweet spot. It's where Kieran and I met a few years ago when I was at Roche. He was at Genentech. We were in those departments. We were a meeting of the minds, came together later to form Plinth. Also, we have a real passion for real world data and combining that with really the best reproducible data science tools. And we really find that these three combined, there's this intersection of value we can really deliver to clients. So I want to start briefly by giving an overview to what is real-world data. Now, this is just going to be a very brief overview, but essentially real-world data, if we look at the definition from the FDA, are data that are routinely collected during relating to patient healthcare status or delivery of care. And what's really critical about RWD is that it comes from a variety of sources. Everything from electronic health records to claims and billing activities to product and data registries. Can also be patient-generated data coming from in-home settings and data gathered from other sources such as mobile devices. And so you can imagine from all these different data sources, there's this incredible potential for learning about how patients are responding to therapies, being treated in the real world outside of the context of a regulated clinical trial. So what is the problem with RWD? Well, what we found over the past several years of working with real-world data is that there's this major, what we call a data to insight gap between the data itself and the insights that teams are trying to achieve from the data. So we can think about this as a three-step process with the gap. So first, typically there is some vendor that is curating the data, gathering it, and that person is that business is then creating a set of source data, which often can be delivered to the data receivers as a set of tables, either in flat CSV files or in a database. And of course, teams want to then gain insights from those data. They want to understand how patients are being treated and are responding to therapies in the real world. But what we find is that people often think of the source data as if once they're getting it, the insights will just be readily apparent once they receive them. But instead, one way we like to think about it is that the source data is kind of like coal. So it's unrefined coal, which you receive, but really what people are wanting to get in the end is gas to put in someone's car so they can go places. And what we find is that there's really a lot of work that needs to be done to fill that gap between that raw coal and getting that gas in someone's car so they can move. So what is in that gap? Well, we found in working with many different real-world data sources that each can be unique, but at the same time, there's common needs that everybody has when they're analyzing these data. So one bucket is on quality and ETL. So real-world data, because it's coming from a variety of sources, and we're going to talk a minute about how they can be different and what different types of messiness can come in, data quality checks are going to be absolutely critical. Summarizing patient-level data is often quite key. So usually when you get a batch of real-world data, it's rare for somebody to feel that all of the data in that delivery is relevant to their research question, to their specific use case. Usually there's just a very small subset of that data that is going to be relevant to your use case. And it's going to take some time to know how to filter the data down to the patients of interest and summarize those data correctly. And then merging data from multiple sources across multiple tables, making sure to do that in a way that is consistent and reproducible. Applying inclusion and exclusion criteria is absolutely key as well. And each of these, again, is going to be very specific to the use case of interest. And it's really important that the users of the data are applying these rules in a consistent, scalable way so that it can be used again and again. And the second batch is really about collaboration and reusability. So not only do we want to perform these checks, perform these analyses in a consistent way, we want to be able to share the results with stakeholders. And that can be through a series of tools. RStudio Connect is an amazing tool for this, leveraging with Markdown, Shiny. These types of tools are absolutely critical. Repeating the analysis with new data. Real-world data sets often come in multiple refreshes. So you might receive data from a provider once a year, once every 6 months, once a month. How are you going to repeat this process to ensure that you're conducting the same analyses again and again in a consistent, scalable way? So these are tons of many different parts of the gap. What we're really focusing on today is on just 2 of these. So we're going to be focusing on data quality checks and summarizing patient level data, and to some extent applying inclusion-exclusion criteria. Okay, so what can lead to quality issues with real-world data? Really, it can come from a myriad of different sources. Perhaps for your research question, the wrong data were collected. These aren't really appropriate for your research question, and so you need to know which data do you want to include, which do you not want to include. Perhaps not enough data were collected. So you might find once you actually get down to conducting your analysis that the number of patients you need to conduct a reliable analysis is just not satisfied by the data. The data could be systematically biased from the patient population that you're interested in. So you're going to want to provide ways to know ahead of time how the data are collected, what the process is, and understand what you would expect from the data if it really is a true representation of the population of interest, and be able to provide those checks. Data might not have been collected in the right format. Lab data, for example, is one that we often see issues with because there are many different types of lab tests, there's different units. So being able to understand how those were collected, look at the documentation, potentially apply transformations to harmonize data over different data sets can be absolutely key. Another thing we're going to be talking about in the workshop and showing a specific example is in ETL processes. So these data, as it's being processed by the provider and it's arriving to the user of the data, there's going to be some extraction, transformation, and loading of the data over different systems. So there can be errors in these systems so that data that originally was in very good shape could actually turn out to be messed up during that process. And we want to provide checks to catch that as soon as we can. So many different sources of issues that could come into data. And really what we find is that the faster and more consistently you can detect and surface those quality issues, the less havoc they're going to wreak, the more quickly you're going to be able to derive the insights that you're interested in. So how do we assess quality? Many different ways, but generally speaking, there's a few things that we need to do. One, we need to develop expectations for what we expect to see in the data. And this can be done at two different levels. One is at the raw data level. So when I say raw data, I mean the example where you're being delivered multiple tables of data that are potentially longitudinal, repeated over patients. You need to check things like, are there foreign key violations? Can I link these tables appropriately? Are the raw values reasonable? If you have a column that indicates patient's weight at a specific period of time, you want to make sure that it's reasonable and that the scale isn't wrong or that it was collected appropriately. And one way we can check that is by providing a set of checks to assume weight should be under a certain amount. If it's not, we want to flag that as quickly as possible so we can address the issue. But we don't just want to do expectations and checks on the raw data. We also want to do this on our analytic data. And by analytic data, we really mean one row per patient data that is filtered to the cohort that you have of interest. And once you get to that specific data set, before you conduct your analysis, could be a survival analysis, table one, whatever analysis you're going to do on that data set, we want to check and make sure that all those data mergings, all of those summaries were done appropriately. So we might want to check things like, for each patient, the simultaneous use of contraindicated drugs should be very rare. If we find that for our patient population, 90% of patients appear to have been given 2 drugs that are contraindicated, that is probably a red flag that something went wrong. That's something that we might not be able to see from the raw data itself. We can only see it once we summarize it to the patient level and within a patient, see what types of drugs they're using. Looking at longitudinality of data. So we might expect, for example, that a patient has at least 1 medical visit per year. Well, that might be hard to find in the original raw data, but once we summarize at the patient level and we calculate a variable indicating the number of visits per year on average, then we can assess whether or not that is really satisfied by our analysis-ready data. So broadly speaking, those are the types of expectations and checks we want to do, and we're going to walk through some examples for you in the workshop. What we also want to make sure we do is we want to embed these checks in reproducible code. what we want to be able to do is ensure that these checks, these expectations that we create in combination with our scientists can be embedded in code and deployed automatically so that the same person who's knows about what the specific issues are potentially with a data set doesn't need to be in every single room telling people, did you check for this? Did you check for that? We want to take that knowledge that they have, embed it in code, and deploy it so that that process can be automated. So one of our absolute favorite tools in the R world for conducting these types of quality checks is the point blank package, which is a really incredible package. And as we were developing this talk, we thought, oh, we love this package so much. We can talk about it, but actually, why don't we reach out to Rich and see if he, the author and maintainer of the package, would like to present it. And thankfully, Rich was kind enough to offer to do that for us. So if Rich is here, which I hope he is, I would love to pass the baton over to him. And I see him. Hey, Rich.
Right here. Hey.
I'd love to pass it over to you to give us an introduction to the point blank package and all the things that it can do for us for automating the checking and reporting of quality checks.
Great. Yeah, I'll share my screen. This will be a presentation within a presentation, which is always interesting. But anyways, point blank. Yeah, it's a package I've been working on for quite a while. And the thing I want to share today is how to validate tables with the point blank package. Okay, my name is Rich. Again, I'm totally reachable on Twitter, GitHub. Yeah, so let's get right to it. So point blank, it exposes two primary workflows for data validation. Basically, you have these two use cases. You really need to understand and get ahead of data quality issues. Okay, so that's one scenario. The other one is you need to check your data before it proceeds in a pipeline. Okay, I got that covered with point blank. More stuff, because point blank is pretty huge as a package. You can do things like validate data tables and test that type unit tests. So almost like you're testing functions in a package, you're testing data in a package and just using it through that workflow. Another thing you can do is if you're just doing programming with data, you can do data checks to get logical values for programming. So that's great for developing conditional statements with data. Okay, when I made this package, I had a few overall design considerations just to make it good. With point blank, you can work with local tables like tibbles and data frames, data tables as well, and database tables like Postgres, MySQL, all sorts of things like DuckDB. I have all sorts of extra tools in the package for understanding new data sets. There's a scan data function that allows you to sort of get an overview of a data set and sort of see all different variables. And you can understand and even spot some data quality issues in that report. Because this is a package that's used all over the world, I have a number of translations because there's lots of reporting. So there's lots of spoken languages, more than just the one shown here is about 11 languages at this point. And I give a lot of attention to making the package documentation and examples really comprehensive. There's just as many lines of documentation source code as there is lines of like package code. So I really expand and give you tons of examples to make just to make it easy for you. Okay, so I'm going to show you one data quality workflow. It's the one where you really need to understand and get on top of your data quality. This centers around a data quality reporting that summarizes the results of validation steps. Okay. The reporting can be stored, published, exported, transformed. Once you get it, you can do all sorts of things with it. You can mine the data and make your own reports. This workflow, it aligns with a key tenet of the package. You want to discover, communicate, and help solve data quality issues. Okay, so this report-based workflow begins with creating an agent. That's a little bit of point-blank terminology. Use the function create agent. That's basically the reporter. The agent is a totally integral part of the data quality workflow. When you get to the agent is the target table, the thing you want to check. Great. And then some directives on interrogation. You might want to have some actions based on the threshold being broken. We'll get into that in a second. End functions is kind of like things you want to do after the interrogation, based on some things that happened, and the language, of course. Great. Okay, so create an agent. And then what we got to do is use a number of validation functions and generate a validation plan. So all these functions I include in the package are the basis for different validation rules. And there's tons of these, 36 validation functions at last count. Okay, then the final step is you interrogate. You actually take your plan and you go to the data and you check and see, you basically interrogate the data. You see whether these checks, turn up like bad data or, good data. So this is like the key construction. Create agent, you have a bunch of functions to make a validation plan, and then you interrogate. And once you get that, you get things like a report. You can get data extracts, things that failed. Sunder data, that's basically a function that gives you like data pieces, a good piece or a bad piece, as it were. And an X list is essentially a giant list full of all the data that you get from the interrogation. So let me just get into it a little bit further. So get 8 data extracts. For each step in your validation, you may have like failing rows, and this just shows you them step by step. Some may have no failing rows, but some steps have lots because we found cells which don't fit our expectations. Okay. And if you use this function, get Sunder data, it's kind of useful in case you want to sort of like eliminate, or not eliminate, but just get a piece of the data, a filtered piece of data, which didn't have any data quality issues based on your validation plan. That can be useful and acceptable in some cases. Okay, we're gonna have some fun here. We're gonna have a little example of like how this really works without really going into the IDE at all. So we're gonna have like a little schematic. We're gonna have a super simple table, 5 rows, 3 columns. We're just gonna like, make some validation rules. Like all values in this column C must be greater than 15. All values in B must be either 0 or 1. We're sort of there. All values in A must fit a pattern of 3 lowercase letters and a digit. Great. So this is kind of like pseudocode for validation rules in a way. We got 2 more here. Well, the last one is columns A, B, and C should not have any missing values. Okay, great. That's our validation plan sort of like written out. We can use validation functions that map to those expectations, or sort of like mental ones right here. Column values greater than or equal, column values in set, column values regex. This one's a combination of column values expression, allows you to just put an arbitrary expression in, and that expression will involve case when from dplyr. And this one right here will be call vals not null. It's not NA, it's basically because this also is used with databases, and that's widely understood as the same as NA. Great, so now I'm gonna put a little bit of code in there. There's some values essentially. So we always state the column, for most cases actually the column, and then like some values that pertain to the particular validation function. So that's what we got here. Okay, so we got this is basically our code. And we're gonna apply that to the simple table. And this will be kind of fun because we'll show how it actually works. Okay, column value is greater than or equal to 15. So we interrogate, and then the interrogation just looks at each of those like cells and their test units. That's what we call them. And either pass or fail. So red is failing because here we have an NA value and we expect a value greater than 15. Okay, so get a little report here. 4 test units pass, 1 fails. Okay, so point blank finds that. So next, column values and then set. Okay, our set is 0 and 1. So we expect all the values here to be part of 0 or 1. But we can sort of see right away that this is 2, so that fails right there. So we get a little report of that. It's always about reporting. 5 units in total, 4 pass, 1 fails. Great, moving on. Regex. So basically this is expecting like 3 letters and a number. We sort of see that. It's hard to see. So let's actually just interrogate. Okay, so the NA definitely doesn't work because they don't work here at all. And this one has 2 numbers at the end. So this finds that. And we see that 3 units pass, 2 fail. Okay, so this is like totally how it works under the hood. Yeah, this one's much more complicated. It involves an expression. When B is equal to 1, C must be greater than 20. When B is equal to 0, it must be less than 20. It only involves this part right here. So the test units are 4. It's kind of custom because that's just the condition. And then, yeah, we get 4 test units and all of them pass. So yay. Okay, so this one right here has 3 columns. So what it does and what point blank does is if you specify multiple columns, it expands the step into like multiple steps for you. So that's great. So now we're going to check each of these columns A, B, and C, whether they have null values or not. The first one does. So we get 1 failing test unit. Second one has none of those. So all passing there. And the third one, it has 1. So basically that's our report for that. Okay, lots of tiny reports. That's the name of the game with point blank. But you combine them into one giant report, which is kind of cool. So you can see for each step, you're looking at some part of the data. You're basically covering your data with different steps, and you gain this like report here. That's what you see in the end. But we can do something even more than that. We can specify thresholds, like for things we're concerned with. For instance, we're concerned with, one failing, like one test unit failing. We want to be, we want to have a special condition for that. Maybe we can act on that. Maybe there could be 2 conditions, like a warning and a stop, and they have different thresholds. We can specify that with a little bit of our code here in action levels. You'll see some of that later on. And I'll just show you, like, when you do that, you get this in the report, sort of a visual indication of what states you entered and how concerned you probably should be based on that data validation. And in the end, in the real point blank package, not the little schematic here, this is that actual report you get. You get this in the viewer of in your IDE, and it's a little bit interactive. You can hover over things and see things. You get CSV buttons, so you can extract some of the data. You can pass this to somebody, and you don't have to know R. They can just hit a button and get like failing rows and put it in their own sort of like system, which is kind of nice because this is all about communication. You can publish this. You can do all sorts of things with this HTML report. It's very adaptable and very useful. Great. So how it works. Basically, the first step is like the validation step index, then the validation function, which is the basis for each validation step. We have the associated columns and values. Those just come from the things you supply, obviously. Table mutation state, and we have something called table of val result. That just kind of like gives you an indication of like what's going on with the table. You can actually mutate the table at any given step. Like say, for instance, you need to generate some KPI values or something else. You can validate on those just for one step, which is kind of neat. You don't have to like make a whole new table and start the process all over again. So it's pretty flexible in that way. And this is the thing you saw earlier, test units, total, passing, failing, and there's also fractional values here. Very, very great to have. And of course, the states, warning, stop, notify. You can use them, you can not use them. It's very useful to use them. They're just basically little placeholders for your, like warning states. And then again, here's the download extracts. So these are actual buttons you can press. Great. And this is the actual real code I used to generate that whole table. It's not too much, really. Once you get into it, you can understand, it's basically create agent once you figure that out. It's not too much of a stretch to know which validation functions you need. And there's actually an affordance in the package to automatically generate this whole thing for you based on a data set, if you just want a jumping off point. Okay, so point blank, besides this workshop, you can try it out in other ways. The repo, which is right here, and the website, it has this link, RStudio Cloud point blank test drive. Basically, it's just a cloud environment with tons of examples you can run. You don't need it on your computer. It just works. And there's like a reference index or function reference section in this point blank website. There's tons and tons of functions in the package. It's so huge. It's insane. But you don't have to know it all. I mean, and this function, this reference section for functions gives you like details on each function and like the context. So yeah, well, it's overwhelming, but it's not that bad once you get into it. Okay, I think that is it for me. Thanks for having me, giving this little mini presentation. I'll be here during the rest if there's any questions or what have you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rich. And I just really can just second everything you said about the incredible diversity of functionality in this package. I remember, Rich, we were having a call some time ago, and I was struggling with something about how to validate it. And at one point, I realized when we were looking through the package that you have a test to make sure that a vehicle identification number is written correctly.
Yeah, that's how crazy this package is.
That is in there. So if that's in there, you'll be amazed what else is in there that'll allow you to not have to write all of these things from scratch yourself. It's really an incredible package, and the documentation is next to it's amazing. So thank you so much for joining and for providing this incredible tool for us. I really can't recommend it enough.
You're welcome. I'll be in the background. Let me know if you have questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Rich. Great. Great. Can everyone see my screen again?
Yeah, we
Awesome.
can. We can.
Great. Thank you. Great. So thank you so much, Rich. So let's talk back to how we want to perform these checks on real world data. And the basic flow that we're going to be going through the hands-on session today is as follows. We're going to start by receiving some raw data from a fictional data provider. We're then going to see how our internal team is going to perform some ETL on that process, on those raw data. We're then going to perform some QC on those raw data, and we're going to discover that there's some issues with it. Once we've solved those issues, which some will come from the raw data and some will come from our own internal ETL process, we're then going to derive our analysis-ready data. This is going to be our data that's filtered to our specific patient population of interest and contains a few key summarized variables that are critical for our analysis. We're then going to conduct a QC test on the analysis-ready data set, again, to make sure that the summarized variables that we've calculated at the patient level are consistent with our expectations. We're going to apply our inclusion criteria, look at an attrition chart, make sure everything looks good. Then we're going to perform our analysis at the end. So this is the basic workflow that we're going to go through. So as an introduction to the hands-on, you'll see at the top here a link to the repository that contains all the code for what we're going through today. And we're going to be using a set of Medicare claims synthetic data. This is really an amazing data source provided by CMS that mimics the structure of Medicare claims data, but contains no real patient data. So you're able to freely use it in presentations like this. And we really find that it's an incredible documentation and teaching tool to use. It's an incredibly large data set. So we are not going to be analyzing all of the data. For the purposes of demonstration, we're going to be focusing on 4 key files. So we're going to have a person file that's already 1 row per patient. And then we're going to be looking at 3 separate multiple row per patient files relating to inpatient claims, outpatient claims, and prescription claims. So what are our goals for the workshop? We're going to be assessing the raw data files for quality. We're going to be defining a cohort. We're going to be creating an analysis-ready data set. And finally, we're going to conduct a survival analysis on that final cohort after we've checked for all of the quality control issues. So I will now switch over to R. Can everyone see my R screen? Awesome, cool. Let's get into it. So again, I've indicated a link to the repository here, github.com/plinthanalytics robust RWD. And I've listed a set of several goals that we're going to be walking through. So first, to set up, we have a series of helper functions throughout this file, just so we're not staring at too many lines of code. But again, it's all contained in the internal functions. So first, we're just going to set up. We've got an RM block file stored in this so that we can ensure that anybody using this repository can use the same versions of packages that we use. So we see here that the library is already synced. That's great.
Can I pause you for a second?
Please.
Some people in the chat are wondering if you could increase the size of your text.
Happy to. How's that? What does the poll say? Better?
Looks great. Thank you.
Cool.
Yeah,
You're so welcome. You're so welcome. I'm always the same. I always want it zoomed in. So I'm with you. Thanks for reaching out. Great. So I was just saying that this was mostly metadata at the top here. We just synchronized with the lock file. And now we're going to load our favorite tidyverse libraries, point blank, the survival package for conducting survival analysis, GT summary, which is going to provide some nice GT summary tables, and ServeMiner as well for visualizing survival data. We have an internal package in this repository called Robust RWD. This isn't on CRAN. This is really just a very lightweight package that we developed specifically for this workshop. And if you dive into the repository, you'll see all the folders in the Robust RWD folder, and you can see all the R files that contain all of the functions that we'll be using in the script. One thing you'll notice as we're running this code is that it is intentionally noisy. What that means is that in a lot of our functions, we have used frequent calls to one of my favorite packages, the CLI package, which I believe stands for Command Line Interface Tools, which is a great package for printing nicely highlighted notifications, warnings, anything you want to send to the console to remind someone or tell someone what's going on under the hood. This is an amazing package for doing that. But sometimes these can get annoying. So we allow an option to either be noisy or to be quiet. Right now for this, I'm going to be noisy, but we can always be quiet, and that's going to turn off all of them. But for now, we'll keep it as noisy. So first step in this process, as I said, is we're going to simulate receiving data from the provider. So we have a helper function here called receive delivery 01. And we're going to assign that to an object called tables 01. When we run that, we see, again, this nice CLI messaging saying, hey, we're receiving data labeled as 01, and we've received 4 CSV files called Inpatient 01, Outpatient 01, Patients 01, and Prescription 01. So we can print these to the console, and we see that this is a named list of tables that have already been read in. So we'll see that the column names for these are all in caps. We see that if we look at the, let me find the patient's data, we can see that it's mostly numerics here. And if we look at the documentation for this data, we'll see that data that is, for example, sex, which is in this, is coded as 1 and 2. It's not coded as male and female. And now for usability, we're going to imagine that our internal ETL team has developed a set of scripts that is performing some ETL process on these raw data to help them be more usable and work well with our internal systems. So we've simulated that process with an ETL1 function. So if I run tables01 and I tell it now run ETL01, we see messages saying, hey, we've applied ETL version 01 to each of the tables. So I've now assigned that to an object called tables01 ETL01. And if I print this, I now see some of the changes. I can see now that column names are in lowercase. I also see now in, for example, the patients table, I'm no longer seeing numbers for these variables. I'm seeing actual strings. So for example, sex is now male and female, and race is now written as text. So this is an internal ETL process we're simulating. And as we're going to see, things can go wrong with that, but we'll get there. So as we said, one of the first things we want to do is to perform QC on our raw tables. And as Rich described, the way we do this in the point blank package is by creating an agent that has a set of expectations that it is then going to interrogate the data to see if the data actually fulfill those expectations or not. So to run that, I'm going to run create agent applied to the patients table, going to add some nice labels for the outputs. And then I'm going to run this internal function expectations patients. So what is that? Expectations patients is a set of functions we've already written that encapsulate expectations we have for specific tables. So if I just run edit expectations of patients, I can see what all is in there. So for example, I see that some variables are going to be required to exist. This variable dsynpuff ID is the unique patient identifier, birth date, death date, sex variable, a race variable, a logical variable for indicating whether or not patients have cancer, whether they have diabetes. Again, we're going to assume here that this is something that we've seen in the documentation for the data. These should exist. So we're going to check to make sure those are there. We're going to check to make sure patient IDs are unique. This is an expectation for a patient file, which we've been told from the documentation should be 1 row per patient. So let's check to make sure that the rows are distinct. For dates, we're going to assume we expect that birth dates and death dates should be above 1900. If we see any before that, that's going to be a red flag. So we want to check for that. For the death observed variable, so there's a logical variable indicating whether or not patients are deceased. We should expect that we will find patients that are both deceased and those that are not deceased. So we want to make sure that this entire set, true and false, is represented in the data. To do that, we use the point blank function called valsMakeSet. Similarly with sex, we expect to see both male and female patients in this data set. So we're going to check to make sure that that's satisfied. And a final check we're going to put in for our analysis, we might want to stratify results or use as inclusion-exclusion criteria whether or not patients have a diagnosis of cancer. So I want to make sure that that variable cancer has both true and false values. So that's saved in the expectations patients function. And then I'm going to run interrogate to compare those expectations against the data. When I run this, I see from point blank that the interrogation has started. There were 13 tests run. Now I can print the result to see, as Rich said, the point blank validation result. So there's 13 different tests here. We see that there's no fails for the majority of these. So key columns exist, the patient identifier exists, the birth date exists, death date exists. This all looks good. The sex column exists. So we can scroll down and then we start to see some issues later on. So let's look at this one. Expect that values of birth date should be after 1900. What we see if we scroll over to the right is that the test was able to run, but we have 20 rows that failed. So we're going to want to look into that. If I click this button, this will actually download the CSV file of the specific rows that failed. But we're going to use another way to assess that in a minute. But that's a really great feature if you want to immediately see what rows had the issue. We also see an issue with call valsMakeSet. So we expected that in death observed, we should see both true and false values. What we're seeing here is that there were failures, that somehow that was not satisfied. Similarly with sex, we expected both male and female, and we're seeing a failure here that says they are not both represented. Finally, with cancer, we expect to see both true and false values of cancer. We're seeing a failure. So we need to see what's going on here. So we could look at the CSV files. There's many ways within the package to extract summary data. What we've done is created a little helper function that we call tidy interrogation, which will return for us 1 row for each test, tell us whether or not for that test, how many rows failed, and whether or not there were any failures or not. So if I run tidy interrogation, on patient's interrogation, I see that there were 4 failures out of 13 tests. And we can see here that these indeed align with the failures we saw in the report. So it was not the case that everyone was born after 1900. We're missing patients that both have and don't have cancer. Same with death observed and male and female. So what's going on here? Let's do some digging. Well, we can look at the CSV files. We can also do a little bit of dplyr. So let's see, fix my spelling errors, if there are any patients here that were born before 1900. And indeed, when I look at the data, I see that there were about 20 patients that seem to be born close to 1700. So that's got to be an issue. We're going to need to flag that. We saw that no patients have cancer. We don't expect that in our data set. We were told when it was delivered to us that it should have a mixture. So let's look at the patient's data, group it by cancer, and tally the results. Indeed, we're seeing that 10,000, all of the patients have a flag of 0. Okay, so we're going to want to look into that. What about recorded deaths? Again, we expect to see a mixture of both recorded deaths and not. And we're seeing, again, all the death observed values are false. That's going to be a problem. And finally, with sex, we're going to group the results by sex and tally the results. And indeed, just confirming, yep, we're only seeing male patients. So based on the overall report, by the tidy summary results, and even if we just jump in with some dplyr wrangling, we see consistent evidence saying that something with this data set is not what we expect. So, okay, so that's the patients table, and we've logged some issues. Now let's look at one of the multiple row per patients tables. One of those is the inpatient table, and this is a table that contains information about patients in inpatient claims. So just like before, we already have a function that has set up a series of expectations that we have for the inpatient table. This would just be a small subset to give you a flavor, but we want to check, for example, here that the patient ID column exists, because we're going to want to link this, so that better be there. There's also some columns on checking on dates. So we have columns that are called claim from date, when did the claim start? And we have a column indicating when did the claim end. We want to check and make sure that these are actually date columns. As we'll see through the ETL process, those should have been captured as dates, loaded into our machine as dates. If that's not the case, we want to catch it. And finally, there's a claims payment amount. So this is indicating the amount of each claim that was paid. These should always be non-negative. So there should not be negative claims here. So let me cancel that. So we're going to apply those expectations to the inpatient data. We're going to do that by creating an agent, applying the expectations, and interrogating the data. So when I run this, we see that the interrogation is completed. There's 4 steps. We can print out the results to see the full report. And we are finding that it looks like everything looks good except for the claim payment amount is positive. We seem to be catching 104 rows where that's not the case. So let's look at our tidy interrogation results. Indeed, we're seeing the same thing. Something's going wrong here. We have failures on the claim amount is positive. So let's dig into the data. So I'm going to pull out the inpatient data, filter it to see which claim amounts were less than 0. And I do indeed see, hey, here's 104 rows that have claim amounts, some of which are slightly negative, meaning that, a slight payment back, but some seem really extraordinarily large. These really don't make sense. So that's something we're going to want to flag. Okay. So we're going to imagine now that we flagged these issues, but now we need to know what caused them. So we're going to imagine that we went to our data provider, said these are a series of issues we've caught through our automated reports. They responded to us saying, you know what, you're right, we had some problems in our own ETL process. All of those have been fixed. We now have a second delivery of data for you. So we can provide that to you as data delivery number 2. For the purposes of this workshop, we have captured this in the receive delivery 2 function, which I can then save to tables O2. So here we see we're getting new CSV files indicated with O2. And again, we have our internal ETL process, which we're going to apply to those tables as well. So now we have our new set of delivered tables with our ETL process applied. So we're not going to trust that the results are all correct. So again, we want to run our run our expectations against these new data. So we'll start by creating an agent, and we're going to do the patients table first. We're going to run the same expectations against that new table, but the same expectations we had before. We run this, you see interrogation has started, 13 steps, everything looks good. And now we're going to skip right to the tidy interrogation results. And hey, look at that. We've gone from 4 failures before, we're making progress, but we still have an issue. The data set contains both male and female patients. That still seemingly is a fail. So we need to figure out what's going on here. So imagine we reach back out to the provider. We're really upset. We say, what is going on here? You fixed 3 of the problems, but you didn't fix the other one. What is going on here? What are we paying you for? And they say, look, we're on it. We've dug into the data. We've checked how we delivered it to you. We've had 5 people look over it. The data are right. There are both males and females in that data set. So we don't know what else to tell you. Please check again with your internal ETL process. So, so we get off our high horse and say, okay, well, we've just mostly been looking at the ETL data. Maybe we should start looking at the raw data. So if I look at just tables O2, this is an object I created before the ETL was processed. We look at those patients' data and we select out the sex variable. We indeed see that, oh my gosh, oh, this is embarrassing. They were right. They did deliver to us this sex column as both ones and twos. Well, then why, when I run it on my ETL data, am I seeing only males for this first set? Okay, the only possible explanation for this is something in our ETL process went wrong. When that conversion from ones and twos was done to characters, something messed up. So imagine we go to our data engineering team, we explain the problem, they say, okay, we'll dig into it. And they say, uh-oh, okay, red face test. So we looked into our ETL process. Here are the relevant lines of code. And yep, at this point, there was a mutate on it, and we converted a factor as string from numeric. And indeed, the levels of 1 and 2 were converted to male and male. So that's on us. Please send some flowers to the data delivery company and thank them for doing all the hard work. This is on us. Okay, so our engineering team has fixed this. They created a new ETL process that they call ETL02 that they promise fixes the problem. And they're even showing us the code. In this case, we've stored it as function ETL patients 02. I look at this and yep, ETL patients 02 looks right. They've fixed that. Okay, great. So, so we're happy now with our ETL process. The data should be good. So let's run it again. So again, let's take our delivered set of tables 2. We're going to run our new ETL02 process. And oh, this is a bug. This should say applying ETLV02. But here we see that it really was 02. So we run it. We are now going to take the new table 2 with the ETL02 patients. We can actually, why not just take a quick look at it? And indeed, we can already see, hey, look at our sex values. We're now seeing male and female. That's what we want. So let's run our interrogation on those patients. We see the result was able to run. We then look at our tidy interrogation results. And we don't have any fails. All 13 tests pass. And where sex, we see that the key columns exist, both male and female. Okay, great. So we've solved 2 problems. We've solved initially a data delivery problem, where it really was on the delivery side, on the provider. And then we solved a problem with our internal ETL process. Again, all of this powered with point blank. So those tests were on the 1 row per patient's data. Now we want to run a set of tests on our inpatient data for, again, the second data delivery with a second ETL process. So we can run that by taking our inpatient table. We create our agent inpatient. We apply the expectations inpatient, which we can actually see in this file as well. So claim admin is the date, claim amounts are positive, key columns exist. We could have more of these if we want. This would be the lightweight set. We run that. We see that the interrogation worked. Let's tidy up the results. And hey, everything's looking good. Now the inpatient data passes all of our tests. And we should feel comfortable now moving on to the next stage in the process after we've evaluated our raw data, which is to now create a 1 row per patient analytic table that combines data from the raw patients table, which is already 1 row per patient, plus results from this inpatient table, as well as the prescriptions table, which I haven't talked about so much about the prescriptions table, but I'll show it in a minute. So maybe I can take a step back. Why do we need to create this final 1 row per patient table? Well, at the end of the day in this analysis, we're going to be conducting a survival analysis. And for our survival analysis to run, there's an assumption when we provide the data to the statistical test function that each row represents a patient and columns indicate potential indicators, covariates, and key survival time, and whether or not a death was observed. So at the end of the day, we're going to need that nice, tidy 1 row per patient table that combines data from multiple different sources. Now, to do this, you could write a lot of bespoke dplyr code. So we could take the patients table, we can then join that to a summarized version of the inpatient table, join that to a summarized version of the patient table. That could be a fair amount of code to do that. And if this is a set of summary operations that we expect to be done again and again, we want to functionalize those. So the way we like to do that is by creating bespoke add ORPP functions. So let me show you how that looks for the add ORPP inpatient. What this will do is it will take a 1 row per patient data set. It will then take an inpatient table, which contains inpatient data. We then want to tell it what we're joining on the patient level. What is that patient identifier? We can then provide a series of assertions, make sure that the tables are as we expect them to be. We are then going to take that inpatient table, which is multiple rows per patient. We're going to group it by that patient identifier, and then we're going to calculate a number of summary columns. We're going to calculate whether or not they have any inpatient claims, which in this case, because this table only contains rows from patients that have claims, that is always true. We're going to calculate the number of claims that they have. We're going to calculate the median inpatient amount. So for across all of the patients' inpatient claims, what was the median amount? We're going to calculate that using a median and a min and a max as well. Once we calculate that 1 row per patient table from that multiple row per patient, we're then going to join it onto our original 1 row per patient data set and potentially replace some NAs if patients weren't present in the inpatient table. And then finally, again, because we like to be noisy, we've got some helper functions that will provide some messaging to indicate which variables were added and what the definitions of those variables were. And that'll make more sense once I show the actual results. But this is kind of how we like to capture this summarizing of patient multiple row per patient level data into 1 row per patient data. So we're going to take our tables O2 second delivery, second ETL process table of patients data. We're then going to add ORPP summarized variables from the inpatient table, which we pull out of the same object. And we're going to do the same thing on the prescription table. So if we look at the add ORPP prescription function, we'll see that this also provides some summary data at the prescription level. This will take a prescription table and calculate things such as how many prescriptions do we have evidence for the patient having across this table? What is the median payment amount for the amount that the patient actually had to pay for these prescriptions? What is the median cost of these prescriptions? We can also calculate some interesting variables like, on average, what % of the total cost of drugs did the patient have to pay? So this could be interesting if people are looking at what is the financial burden of individual patients on these drugs that they're acquiring, what % at the patient level are patients paying. So we're going to capture all of those nice summary operations in this add ORPP prescription function. So if I run this set of pipes, we can see some of this nice summary information being printed out. So we're taking our original table, we are adding 5 variables from inpatient, and we see exactly what the variables were that were added. And we can also see some metadata about the definitions of those variables. So anytime someone's running this, there's many ways for them to understand what's going on under the hood. They can look at the raw code, or they can look at the printout to see what the definitions of these variables are. I know probably many people on the call right now are asking, where are those definitions stored? How did you get that? Well, there's a number of ways to store this. The way we do it right now is we essentially have a master table of definitions. So if we look in this definitions file, we see that there's a master table that has one row per potential summarized variable and has a definition that someone is given. So the idea here would be, as you're developing this workflow, as you're developing new add ORPP functions, when you define these new summary variables, you want to add the definition of those variables to that master definition file. And you can imagine you can also reference this file when creating reports. So once you deliver the final potential one row per patient table to an internal stakeholder or external, you can just wrap around this definitions table to also provide a nice data dictionary along with it. So that's where those definitions are coming from. I see that there's some potential movement in the chat. Are there any questions? I'm happy to take a stop if people have questions right now to address them if anyone has any. And 3, 2, 1. All right, we'll move on. It's very much my hope that we'll have plenty of time for Q&A later. So now we have our one row per patient table, which we can print out, and we see that 10,000 patients, we have 25 columns. Now, you might say, okay, now we're ready to start creating our cohort. We're ready to start conducting our survival analysis, but nope, we're not ready yet, because we also want to apply some expectations to this one row per patient table. At this point, we've never actually done any tests to see if the patient level, do these values make sense? So, for example, what values do we add here? We have the median prescription total cost amount. Maybe we have some expectation about, at the patient level, what that median amount should be. And if there's patients that have a median prescription cost that exceeds some threshold, we want to flag that at this point, because that's not going to be reflected in the tests at the raw tables because they weren't summarized at the patient level. So now that we've created that table, we can now create a set of expectations at the ORPP level. And if we look at the file, we can see that we've just very lightweight added a few here. So we have, for example, there's a variable survival years, and we expect that this should be greater than 0. This is survival from birth, so we don't expect anybody that has a value of 0. We might expect that a patient's median inpatient payment is greater than 0. And a nice thing here, that's this point blank package is amazing, because if you want to know whether or not NA values should be allowed, you can indicate that with this flag NA pass or not. And in this case, we think it's okay for patients to have never had any inpatient claims. So their value on this table is going to be missing. And we can indicate here that that's totally fine. And finally, we might add another expectation that the median prescription costs should be above some amount. So we can specify that here. So let's create our agent from the ORPP table. We're going to apply our expectations at the ORPP level, and then we're going to interrogate. So I run this. We see 3 tests that ran. We can look at the very nice point blank validation output again. We see everything is looking really golden here. This is super clean. We're not seeing any fails. Everything evaluated just fine. We see our 3 tests that we expect. And now just to print it to the console, we can use our help for tidy interrogation function. And indeed, we see no failures across all 3 tests. We look good to go. Now, again, in this case, I've just tested 3, but you can imagine that there could be many more tests you want to be running at the patient level if you're going to be looking at some of those other variables as potential variables to use in your analysis. In this case, we'll just do 3. Okay, so we've got our one row per patient table. We've passed our raw table tests after checking some issues on the data delivery side and on the ETL side. We've created a one row per patient table with summarized variables across multiple row per patient variables. We've done our tests applied to the multiple row or the one row per patient table that all look good. The next thing we want to do is apply attrition criteria. And what I mean by that is typically when you receive, especially a real-world data set, there's only going to be a subset of the population that you're interested in for your research question. If you're looking at outcomes for patients of a specific subset of the population, whether it's demographics, age, sex, whether it's treatment patterns, you only want patients that have a certain line of therapy, who have a certain disease status. We want to be able to filter those out and keep track step by step of how patients are dropped from the analysis. And the way we do that is through an attrition table. So we've created a helper function here called create attrition. Essentially what that does is it allows us to take a one per patient table and then take a name expression pairing that indicates what our criteria are in words. In this case, we're going to say we want patients that have a race of either white or black. And for that definition, we're going to define it as race CD is in the set white or black. And for this analysis, let's say we only want patients that have diabetes. So we're going to say diabetes equals true. Let's say they need to have at least an inpatient payment median of 10,000. And so we set that here. Median prescription cost is at least 50, 18 years of known survival. Again, I'm just going to assume that this was something that the researcher said this is the population they're interested in. So if I run this function, it will then create our attrition table. And if we print it at the console, we see some really valuable information. So we see how many patients we had at the start of our analysis, in this case, 10,000. We then see once we went to the second attrition criteria, race is white or black, we dropped 677 patients to drop us our total down to 9,300, and so on and so forth, all the way up into our final cohort, which we see has 198 patients. Now, this could be a place where if you already in your analysis plan have expected to have, let's say, at least 500 patients, this could be a time where you stop and say, whoa, we need to go back. Maybe we don't have enough data to conduct our analysis. But for now, we're going to assume that this meets our threshold for how much we wanted. So, of course, you can print the table. You can also plot it. So we have a nice helper function in our package to plot attrition. And if you run this, we can see the same data, but just now nicely displayed in table form. OK. So we've got our attrition now. The numbers look good, 198 patients. That looks about right. We now need to take our one row per patient table and now actually filter it down to our patients of interest. So to do that, we're going to take the table. We'll filter based on the exact criteria that we had above. When I run this, I now have our final cohort table. And we see here that we have these patients who are ready to go for our final analysis. So we got our cohort table. We're feeling pretty good about it. Now we can finally get to our analysis. And you can imagine all the steps we needed to take through to get here. So with real world data, often we assume we can jump right to conducting that survival analysis. But even in this very, very condensed version of what I've shown here, there's a lot of steps we want to go through before we get to that point. So in this case, I'm going to calculate survival, where I'm going to use survival years as the follow-up time. The event is whether or not a death was observed. And let's say we want to understand if there's disparities between Black and white patients in our cohort in their survival. And we're going to run that based on the cohort table. So if I run this, we have our fit. And now we can create a survival plot. This is ggsurvplot from the SurvMiner package, which we really love as well. And we look at our final plot, and what we're seeing is that it does appear that the median survival for white patients is substantially longer than those for Black patients. However, as we can see from the confidence intervals here, there's probably not enough data here, especially from the Black population, for us to really know whether or not this is a meaningful difference or not. So this could be a case where we would need to go back to see, hey, why aren't we having enough data from Black patients here, we can then go back to the source to understand what's going on. And that's really it, step by step in a nutshell. So what have we done in the past 20 minutes? We have read in the raw data. We have applied QC checks on the raw data, found some issues with them, reached back out to the data provider. They solved the issues. They sent us back new data. Still wasn't looking quite right. We blamed them at first, said, you still didn't get it right. But then oh no, egg on our face. Turns out, no, it was our internal ETL team. They had an issue. We're able to track that down. We solved that. We then can generate a 1 row per patient table from multiple tables. We conducted QC checks on the ORPP table. We defined a cohort based on multidimensional criteria, and then finally conducted our final analysis, including an attrition plot. Now,
Nathaniel,
yeah, Kieran.
we have some questions. I'm wondering if we could go live.
Please, I'd love it.
Yeah, Dagmara says that there are some patients in the cohort that were born in 1927, and that would mean that they're almost 100 years old. Could we go and add an additional assertion and see if we can't find patients that are unusually old?
Let's do it. This is why I'm grateful to have Rich here, just in case, as I'm diving into point blank details, if I'm not doing something the proper way, he can jump in and help. So let's see here. So we expected people to be born after 1900. And so if I remember the question, the concern was that some people were born after 1920. So maybe we say, what should we do, 1930?
Well, I think we could do it here, or maybe we could even do it at on the 1 row per patient level to find patients that are still alive that were born.
Yep, we can definitely do that. And actually, a cool thing about point blank is that we can chain multiple expectations together if we want. So because that birth date is both in the raw patients table and it's going to be in the 1 row per patient table, we could just embed it in the expectations at the patient level and then run it again at the ORPP table. There's no reason why you can't do that. So I'm just going to add it here at expectations patients. Let's run this. Okay, now let's go back to our ORPP interrogation. And you'll see here, actually, I commented it out. But my prediction is, if I now add this, because again, our expectations ORPP, I don't believe that had anything to do with birth date. Yeah, so that's in our expectations on the patient level. So let's run this. Let's run our tidy interrogation.
We get a slight typo in the date.
Oh, I did? Oh,
Yeah.
Thank you. I see, Rich, that's why I knew it was going to be so great to have you here, man.
Waiting in the wings, yeah.
Yeah. What did I do wrong? 1930. Oh, yeah. 1930. 0101? I don't know why it looks like too many zeros, but I think that's right. Okay. And let's update this. Born after 1930. All right, let's try that again. Let's look at our tidy results. And hey, look at that. Great idea. We now see that there's 2,913 patients that were not born after 1930. So what could we do here? We could go back to the data provider, say, is this really the case? They might say, yep, indeed, this is a certain patient population and be old. Okay. Or we might decide to exclude them from the attrition from the final analysis. We could just include, in addition, additional criteria saying that patients can't have survived more than, I don't know what, a certain number of years. That'd be another way to do it.
And Nathaniel, if it was, I think we might even want to use the case because I think what the comment Dagmara said was that it'd be unlikely that they're alive today, not that they're born necessarily on that date, but that they have an actual age. So we could use an ORP variable to calculate their age. If death date is missing, then assume that they're alive still today. So get their current age.
Wonderful point.
And then assert that their age at death or age if they're alive today is less than 100 years or something like that.
Fantastic point. Totally agree.
It's a great question. Thank you.
Love that. This is what makes real-world data so fun. This is great. So maybe while other questions are coming in, one thing I thought as we were preparing this was, a natural question one might ask is, okay, this is all great. This is nice is a demo of how you could do this, but would we actually expect somebody to go through these steps by hand with each data set and each data delivery? And of course, the answer is no. Just as we discussed earlier, and that bottom portion of the graph of the data to insight gap is we need a way to automate this process and deliver it to stakeholders in a way that they don't need to be writing code. They don't need to be hands-on. This can get delivered to them. So one of the amazing things about R is all of our great tools to do this. And Markdown is one of them. And Corto, I know you're out there, and I will be learning you soon, I promise. I'm sure other people on this call can agree with me there. But for now, we're going old school with Markdown. So what I've done here is I've captured all of those steps that we did in a Markdown document. And a key thing we can do with this document is capture this in a report. We can parameterize it so that we can add parameters to this to say, hey, look at a data set coming in from this source. We can schedule it on RStudio Connect to say, when a new data set is entered in, please run this and deliver it to stakeholders. And what can that report look like? There are many ways we could have it look, but as one example, what I've done is just created this simple GitHub style document, which will summarize all of the key results in a single HTML file. And you can again imagine that this file could be hosted on your server, updated when new data come in. And we see here the QC at the level of patients. We see, oh, this is interesting. Before there weren't fails here. But now that we've adjusted it, this is a great example. And now we actually do see that there's failures with the 1930. That's great. We see that there's a failure. We see for the inpatient data, everything looks fine. ORPP table, things look good. I think the reason it looks good here is in this Markdown document, I didn't explicitly also add the patient's expectation to the ORPP. That's why it's not failing here, is because we didn't explicitly add that as well. We see our attrition table, and we see our final analysis. Now, ideally, actually, what you would probably want to do here is set up this report so that if the QC checks fail, it should not return the survival analysis. It should stop and say, sorry, I'm not going to print it for you because there's potential issues with these data. So before, I'm not running the analysis. And we can automate that process. Now, for this example, I didn't do that. Not expecting there to be failures, but that's something you would want to do so that information is only getting to stakeholders when it has gone through that quality check process, and we can be confident that the results are meaningful. Great, Kieran, you're doing a great MC job. Any other questions from the audience?
There was a question about publishing our demo code to CRAN. I think the answer there is it's available on GitHub. The Point Blank is on CRAN, so you absolutely can have access to all the power that Rich has put in our hands. And you can access the examples on how to run them and how to download this data and all that through GitHub. So that should suffice, but this particular example code will not be published to CRAN.
Yeah, but feel free to fork it, use it any way you'd like. Great. So I think I will, unless there's any other pertinent questions on the R side, I'm happy to stop sharing on the R and switch back over to the deck. But again, we got plenty of time for questions afterwards, should people want to.
Hello, can I ask a question?
Of course.
So thank you for presentation, it's really nice. And then the one thing that I sometimes struggle is not that much when I get the file in the R, but the problem what type of file I need to read in.
Mm.
Like, for example, I agree, R is amazing with the data management and so on, but it's really bad with Excel files. I'm not talking about CSV files, I'm talking about Excel.
Oh, yes, I know them very well.
So how can you be sure that actually what you read in R from Excel is actually that? Because what I see sometimes, floating point error, like for example, for the PK samples, it's critical. If it's 3.5, it should be 3.5 and not 3.499999, you know? And this is something that you, like with your presentation, this is nothing you can basically track. So do you have any solution for that? And the same, not only for the floating point error, but also for the date or time. R transforms it, and sometimes in a wrong way. So you can have in Excel a time column that says, for example, PK sample or a dose was given at the time 2 p.m., 35 minutes, for example. And then when you read it in with the packages that are available now, sometimes it puts some date in front, which is very much off. Like for it should be like 2019, but it puts some date, I know, 1888. And those type of things. Is there any way you can actually, I see some command read the package, yeah. Yes, this is the package that actually, yes, and this package actually creates these issues as well.
Ooh, okay.
So yeah, so wondering your experience.
Yeah, that's a tough one because like on import, you really have no way to check before and after, right? You may have to just file an issue with read Excel. That's the main thing. Otherwise, you may have to do some like data, like I don't know, like rescuing on your own side.
Yeah, I've definitely seen issues with people opening Excel files in different open source programs and then resaving them and getting the data changed in some ways as well. I think it's fair to say that you should probably you probably can still run certain assertions. Like one might be able to say a floating point number when cast as a string can only have a certain number of digits. And then if you have that 3.4999999 example, that would hopefully catch that. So there are ways to protect yourself from those things, but agreed, that's very annoying.
Yeah, I unfortunately can't provide much more expertise here because my first answer about files coming in as Excel is, can you please convert it to CSV first? It sounds like you're probably working with data where that's not an option, in which case, yeah, I think leveraging the R community. I'm curious, have you posted any issues to like the Read Excel package repository and gotten any responses from the community? I just wonder if it's a problem that's been solved or if it's something that they would know how to fix, at least on the date side or in the FPU side as well.
So as far as I know, it's still an open issue. So yeah. So it's not that easy, I guess, because Excel and R are not talking the same language.
Yeah.
Okay, but thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
I think my only recommendation, if I have one, is just get the Excel file itself and try to export it as CSV and make those like, do the rescue there, I suppose.
Yeah, you can do that, but it actually also can the dates can be transformed. And so it's not, and if you have a big studies with millions of rows, so it can be risky to take that responsibility.
And it's Svetlana, is what you're saying that it can, I'm just imagining if the dates are transformed incorrectly but consistently across all rows, then you could potentially correct it. But if it's, some rows are formatted one way, some are another, and you're applying the same, okay, that's That's
And this is the trick, yeah, because it's not always correct.
Man, that's a hard one. That is a real hard one.
Oh, okay.
I can only reassure you that I would feel your pain.
Okay, thanks.
All right, if there are no more questions.
Fantastic. Great.
Yeah.
So let's jump back into the presentation. We've got a few wrap-up slides. Great. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Thank you. Great. So look what we just did in the past about 30 minutes. Examined example Medicare data, looked at multiple files from coming into CSVs, a combination of 1 row per patient, multiple row per patient. We addressed issues. Oh, actually, we have a diagram for this. So we went through the process of looking at the raw data, applying the ETL. We did our raw QC. We flagged an error. That went back, helped us to fix the raw data issue on the data provider side. We then went back to our original ETL process, still found the issue. We yelled at the data provider, almost told them we were going to break things off, but then we said, oh my gosh, wait, maybe it's actually on us. And our head of data engineering came to us sheepishly and said, oh gosh, yep, there was a bug. Please, let's send flowers. They updated the ETL v2 process, and we then saw that our QC checks on the raw data were green. We then derived our analysis ready data set, combining 1 row per patient and summarized multiple row per patient values. We wrapped those up in helper functions that provided nice messaging, encoded the definitions of those so that others don't need to write them from scratch. We can have a centralized place where we're storing these definitions and can surface them to users. We then performed our QC on the analysis ready data. Once that passed, we applied our inclusion criteria, looked at the number of patients that we had left, looked at the attrition chart, and finally conducted our survival analysis. And after that, we showed an example where we could wrap this up in a reproducible markdown report that could be deployed or shared on an automated way. So this is really has been an overview of many of the types of processes that we think are critical to go through when analyzing real world data, or really any messy data that you're accessing, whether it's real world healthcare data or not, but certainly for real world healthcare data. We find that these steps are absolutely critical. And again, to fill that data insight gap, what we focused on today was the data quality checks, summarizing patient level data, and some on applying inclusion exclusion criteria. But there's really so much more to this process that we find that is critical to do for teams to, again, go from that coal that they think is going to power their car. But really, there's a lot of work needed to really get that gas into the engine, and to do that in a way that's scalable, that is reproducible, that is robust, is something that's critically important. And thankfully, anybody that tells you you can't do those things with R is wrong, because this is really the language that has, looking at the point blank package from Rich, looking at, tidyverse, Markdown, Shiny, we really can do end-to-end process, do this in an end-to-end way, all using R.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
There we go.
Hey, was there a question?
It's going pretty good.
Oh, I got it.
Yeah,
No worries.
Certainly, I've got a kind of a conference thing that
I think. Does anyone?
I'm there. Sorry. Took a second to get to it. I think you're good now. Sorry about that.
Okay, I'm going to mute our Pharma. Okay, we're muted. Great, thanks.
Yeah, no, I think that was a participant.
Oh,
So
cool.
This is Phil. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Phil.
Yeah.
It's hard when I don't see faces.
No, that's okay. I had stepped away to get some coffee and I heard it happening in the hallway, so I ran back in to mute the person. But I think we're good now.
Cool, thanks, Phil. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Great. So if these are problems that you're facing, we hope that the examples we provided will be helpful to you, whether it's through our example code or through some of the packages we mentioned, some of the processes. we really hope that you can use those to help improve your processes. But if you need help with them, of course, we are here to help. We love solving these problems. So don't hesitate to reach out to Plinth. You can reach us at www.plinth.co or at info@plinth.co. Write us on LinkedIn. We're very happy to talk to you to help solve your problems. And that is it. I like to be short and pithy.
All right.
So we're at an hour and a half. And I know I love when talks end early. So I'm happy to be here to answer questions or give people the time back. You can reach out anytime. Happy whatever the group wants.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm just making a couple of quick statements real quick. So for those of you that came to the workshop today and would like to get a certificate for completion or attendance, when you exit Zoom today, you'll see a survey pop up. So just be sure to fill that out. And thank you so much to Nathaniel and the team. This has been such an awesome topic and interesting area of data science and pharma and healthcare and life sciences. It's a really exciting space. Yes, it was recorded, and we hope to edit it and have it up on our YouTube channel sometime into the future. I can't give you a date exactly, but usually about a month or so after the conference. With that, the team will stay around if people want to chat live or have questions through Zoom, but I'll put the information for Credly in there, and thanks for coming and have a wonderful afternoon.